Good afternoon, everybody. For today, we'll talk about the chapter by Hilbroner on Adam Smith. Um, the book again is by Robert Hilbroner, titled "The Worldly Philosophers," and actually, he's talking about the key economists, um, particularly Adam Smith, uh, Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, and the rest. So the chapter that we'll be tackling today will be on Adam Smith, and he titled the chapter the world, the wonderful world of Adam Smith. So this chapter is preceded by the chapter on the economic revolution, right? And the argument there was that um, you can only understand the contribution of the man, the person, Adam Smith, if we understand the world where he's coming from, the world that he was trying to explain, and the key event, the key moment that he was attempting to articulate and he was prominent for is a world that is characterized by what Hilbroner calls the economic revolution. So, yeah, we've already tackled that. So let's now talk about Adam Smith. So, yeah. So, all right. So let's talk about his vision. But to talk about his vision, we need to talk about what question really uh, was he grappling with, right? So his question was, if individuals pursue their own interests, meaning if they become selfish, put it in simpler terms, how can society still hold together if people are pursuing their self-interest? In short, if it's not part of the motivation of people to serve society, but instead what they just want to do is to satisfy their own interests, their own uh, they want to do, what they want to buy, what they want to produce. Does that mean that society will uh, disintegrate? The society will be destroyed? The society will turn into chaos? But Adam Smith was prominent for saying no. Even if people are pursuing their own self-interest, somehow their pursuit of their own self-interest has an unintended consequence that is good for society. So, yeah, again, his question basically is, um, if individuals pursue their own interests, how can society still hold together? And his answer was not to design a strong state, a stronger state like um, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, who imposes order into a chaotic society in the state of nature. His Adam Smith's answer to the question is not to create a more powerful ruler. Instead, what what Adam Smith tried to envision, to imagine, was what he called a system of perfect liberty. System of perfect liberty, which he also later described as a system of natural liberty. Now, this system that he was imagining was much larger than a theory about prices or markets. You cannot reduce Adam Smith to the market or the prices. All right. Smith wanted to understand how an entire society could organize itself, reproduce itself, grow, and change without somebody or someone standing above society directing. every activity like a cosmic dictator, directing, micromanaging what we do. And that's part of what makes his question so remarkable, because the society that Adam Smith was living in did not obviously look orderly. He was able to find order in a disorderly world, in a chaotic world. 18th century England was marked by poverty, violence, exploitation, irrational customs, and enormous inequalities. Yet Smith believed that beneath this apparent disorder was discoverable principles of order, social order. And this thinking exemplifies or reflects a broader Enlightenment confidence that apparently chaotic phenomena could be explained through underlying laws. There's this confidence in the power of the intellect to make sense of reality. Adam Smith belongs to the Scottish Enlightenment. He essentially asked whether the same, meaning the search for an underlying logic and behind reality, could be done for society. This was done by, for example, Newton when it comes to physics. He's trying to do the same with society. A search for underlying laws, not of nature, but for society. So, this brings us to the question of who really was Adam Smith. Um, we'll talk about his life a little, because of course this illuminates the context in which his ideas emerged, right? So, unlike some philosophers, unlike some thinkers who only became famous after they died, Adam Smith was already famous during his lifetime. He was not an obscure academic working in isolation. By the 1970s, he was already a recognized intellectual figure. Voltaire, for example, had heard of him. David Hume, in fact, the philosopher, right, is prominent for um, his work on morals and ethics, and also in his work on society. He's a very prominent philosopher. David Hume was his close friend. Students traveled from places like places like places so distant from Britain, like Russia, to hear his lectures. But it would, yeah, we would not expect Smith to be this revolutionary figure in the sense of ushering in a change in our understanding of society. This is not the typical, no, he's not a uh, very serious philosopher, thinker. Yeah, he's instead very eccentric. He's famously eccentric. Um, we hear stories, many stories, about how absent-minded he was. Uh, for example, he could become so absorbed in thought that he lost awareness of his surroundings. He could walk while thinking. In fact, there's, I think, stories that he fell into a pit, no, by being so consumed in conversation. He would imitate people unconsciously. Yeah, to become detached totally, absent-minded indeed, about what's happening around him. But yeah, these stories are amusing, yes, but they also reveal something useful, just that Smith has this extraordinary capacity for abstraction, abstraction. And in fact, his eccentric personality did not diminish his reputation. Instead, but it was even perhaps part of why he was regarded as one of the foremost philosophers of his generation. It's just weird, but in an intelligent way, right? So, um, Smith taught what was then called moral philosophy at Glasgow. It was the subject that he was teaching. But take note, you should not understand this subject as simply a course about morality, no personal morality. Is this the good thing to do? Is this the right thing to do? Because in the 18th century, moral philosophy was a very broad, it's an enormous field. It included natural theology, it included ethics, it included political economy. So Adam Smith could move from questions about the structure of the universe to questions about morality, law, government, and economic activity. So this gives us a clue about his intellectual project. Adam Smith, the Enlightenment philosopher, wanted to discover order, order beneath the apparent chaos world that he was living in. Natural theology, for example, asked whether there was an underlying order in the universe. World is full of suffering, but perhaps there's a reason behind that. God has reasons that we do not understand for that. Um, Smith extended this intellectual habit into social life. He was asking if nature has discoverable laws, and Newton was able to cover that, for example. Might society have discoverable laws as well? And that question became the foundation of his social philosophy. So, yeah, let's go broader to, to this orderly world, no, that he was living in, which he claimed was actually ordered. So, let's go back to time to 18th century England. Try to imagine that world. Do you think you would immediately see a beautifully coordinated economic system? Uh, no, probably not. Because what you would see at the time would be minds where men, women, and children worked under horrifying conditions. Children would spend long hours, long periods on the ground in these mines. Even pregnant women could be forced to haul coal. You would see agricultural workers traveling across the countryside searching for seasonal employment. Some even arrived with almost no possessions. And then probably you would encounter the emerging factory system. For example, there was this silk factory, which was so enormous by 18th century standards. It contained thousands of mechanical movements and employed large numbers of workers, including children. Children with extraordinary long shifts. And if that's what you see, this was hardly a picture of harmony. But we have here Adam Smith, who looked at this world and believed that the laws of social organization were operating beneath the apparent disorder. That is the puzzle that we must keep in mind throughout the thought of Adam Smith. So, yeah, we must go back to his early life and education. Adam Smith was born in 1723 in Scotland, which is a small town in Kirkcaldy. I think that's how you pronounce it. A small town of roughly 1,500 people. His father had died before Adam Smith was born, and he was raised largely through the care of his mother and his uncle. And when Adam Smith was 4, he was kidnapped by a traveling group. His uncle pursued the kidnappers, who eventually abandoned the child. Smith survived and grew into an exceptionally gifted student. At 17, he entered Oxford on scholarship. But Oxford, during this period, was not the highly organized research university we might imagine today. Many professors had effectively abandoned serious teaching. Smith therefore educated himself extensively through reading. Indeed, he nearly faced disciplinary trouble for possessing David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. Remember that philosopher? It's really an enemy of many apologists. Because, yeah, Adams, no, David Hume's work was largely considered dangerous, dangerous for your faith. That early intellectual independence would become characteristic of Smith throughout his life. So later on, Adam Smith became professor of moral philosophy, as we discussed earlier, at Glasgow, and was in. But first, in 1751, first taught logic, and then soon afterward, he became professor of moral philosophy. But Glasgow was one of the great centers of the Scottish Enlightenment. But Smith was not always conventional. He was friends with David Hume, di ba? And of course, attracted criticism. Smith, for example, has views on religious instruction which were very unconventional. And he resisted certain compulsory religious practices within university life, like, for example, very skeptical prayer in class. So, nevertheless, his students admired him enormously. His lectures became very, very famous. Then in 1759, Adam Smith published the book titled The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And the book um, addressed a problem, fascinating problem. If human beings are so self-interested, will the moral judgments that they make really be moral? Right? How can they make moral judgments? Right? If human beings are deep down really self-interested, are the judgments that they make moral? It's a very valid question, right? Smith argued that work that people possess the capacity to imagine themselves in another person's position and judge conduct from the standpoint of an impartial observer. You can enter another person's shoes and thus become objective, impartial if you do that. And this matters because you'll see that his later economic thought also asks how private motives can produce broader social consequences beyond individual intentions. So this one, Smith became professor of philosophy at Glasgow. Glasgow was, yeah, Smith had vegetable views, first book, state theory, all right. Now, Adam Smith's life changed after writing the theory of moral sentiments. There's this influential political figure with the name of Charles Townshend. Is that Townshend or Townsend? I'm not sure. Let's just say Charles, who became um, enamored by the book of Smith and wanted Smith to tutor the young Duke of, how do you pronounce this one? Buccleuch. So Buccleuch. Stop. Smith became the tutor of the young Duke. And the offer by Charles for him to really accept the job of becoming tutor was, was very extraordinary. The financial offer was extraordinary. Previously, Smith had earned 170, I think this is pounds, 170 pounds annually from university fees. But to become a tutor, the young Duke, Charles offered him 500, 500 pounds annually. So yeah, basically would refuse that offer. So Adam Smith accepted. There's also a lot of privileges other than the salary offer. So in 1764, he left Glasgow and accompanied the Duke on a European Grand Tour, where during this tour, they traveled through France, and of course, they eventually reached Paris, where Smith encountered important French intellectuals. During this period, in 1764, Smith began seriously developing the work that would eventually become his or prominent work, his prominent book, The Wealth of Nations. So, very thick book. The European journey, therefore, became an important stage in the formation of his economic thought. Right now, in Paris, Adam Smith encountered, pronounce this one, Quesnay. I think that's Francois. Is that Francois? Francis? Is that just Quesnay? One of the leading economic thinkers of 18th century France. And Quesnay had developed the school in economics called Physiocracy, the Physiocratic school. And their contribution, the contribution of the Physiocrats, was that they rejected the idea that wealth simply meant accumulating gold and silver. Instead, the Physiocrats argued that wealth came from production. In fact, Quesnay even represented economic activity as a circulating system, like the circulatory system of the human body with nerves. He presented that in his famous Tableau Economique, Economique, no, pronounce that, where he compared economic circulation to the circulation of blood in the body. But yeah, while that was really an advance, conceptualize production as the source of wealth. Adam Smith had a disagreement with the Physiocrats because the Physiocrats believed that agriculture was uniquely productive because nature contributed directly to production. The Physiocrats believed that um, it was agriculture and not manufacturing which is the source of wealth. Because manufacturing for them was considered sterile. Sterile. Adam Smith would reject this distinction because Smith recognized that labor could create wealth in manufacturing as well as agriculture. Now, this helped move economic thought toward a broader conception of productive labor and value creation. Okay, it's the engagement between Smith and Wisney. Let's now go back to what we mentioned earlier, the book that really in prominent as a contribution of Adam Smith to economics. In 1766, the journey of Smith in Europe ended abruptly after the death of the brother of the young Duke. Smith returned to Britain and eventually settled in Kirkcaldy. There, he spent years developing the thick book, The Wealth of Nations. He continued exchanging ideas with important intellectuals, including Samuel Johnson and Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was particularly important because Franklin provided Smith with information about the American colonies. Smith became convinced that the American colonies possessed extraordinary economic potential. In fact, he predicted that the colonies could become one of the world's greatest and most formidable nations. It's the encounter between Smith and Benjamin Franklin. After years of work, eventually, in 1776, the book appeared, The Wealth of Nations. But the coincidence is so remarkable because it was the same year that the American colonies declared independence. So in the same year that the American colonies declared independence, Smith published a book that would transform how people understood economic society. American Revolution coincided the same year with another revolution in the field of economics by the release, with the appearance of an important book, Wealth of Nations. But why do we say that the Wealth of Nations was revolutionary? It was revolutionary, but we must be careful. In what sense? Right? Because although it was important, the ideas in the Wealth of Nations were not totally, completely, absolutely original because he borrowed from many people. He was standing on the shoulders of giants, as we say. He borrowed ideas from John Locke, from Bernard Mandeville, Mandeville, Petty from Cantillon, this Turgot, Supesnay, David Hume, and many others. So the importance of his genius of Adam Smith was not in inventing every idea he talked about in the book. His genius instead was in bringing the scattered insights together into a single comprehensive system. He was a synthesizer, just like how Thomas Aquinas, for example, in the medieval world, is called the great synthesizer because he borrowed ideas from Aristotle, borrowed ideas from the Jewish philosophers like Maimonides. He synthesized that with the Christian doctrine, Catholic tradition, and sacred scripture. He developed them all together into a comprehensive whole. The same way, Adam Smith has that genius as well, his capacity to bring together, to synthesize into a cohesive whole these contributions from different thinkers before him. So the book, The Wealth of Nations, addresses manufacturing, agriculture, trade, colonialism, education, religion, military organization, wages, profits, prices, and even government. But we must be careful if we assume that it's a modern economics textbook. Instead, at this time, there's no modern economics yet. Diba? The book is a broad philosophy of commercial society. Smith also contributed change in the meaning of national wealth, if you can recall. Right? For example, mercantilist thinking, mercantilism, is often treated accumulated gold and silver as the measure of national power. But Smith emphasized the goods and services available for consumption as the real measure of wealth. How much goods and services can be consumed is the real measure of wealth. And with that revolution, um, economic welfare fundamentally slowly became connected to the material lives of ordinary people. What how much the ordinary people can consume, not just the how much gold and silver were stacked by the monarchies. The real measure of gold is whether the ordinary people can consume the goods and services that they need and they want. So, um, what are the two great questions around which the thought system of Adam Smith revolved around? The first question is, how does society hold together? If individuals separate interests, why does society not disintegrate? And we've already alluded to this earlier. But he also had another question, which is, where is society going? Does society simply reproduce itself? Or does it develop through historical stages? Those are the two enormous questions. And the first question leads Adam Smith towards the laws of the market. The second leads to his theory of economic development. This is why uh, the Wealth of Nations is not just a book about prices. Smith there is trying to explain an entire social order. He wants to understand both how decentralized coordination occurs, the first concern, and secondly, how commercial society develops over time, hence his theory of economic development, the second concern. Okay. Right. Adam Smith talks about how the mechanism of the market begins with self-interest. Self-interest, which means that people work because they want something for themselves. The butcher sells meat because he wants income. The baker sells bread not because he just feels like he wants to become like a good Christian, help those in need. The baker sells bread because he wants income. It's naive to assume that the rich people, negosyante, businessmen, are just doing what they are doing because of sheer goodwill. Instead, there's the profit motive, really. The brewer produces beer, for example, because he wants income. So, what's the point, Adam Smith? Is that these people are not automatically admirable because they're producing goods for society. His point is that society does not require these people to act from pure benevolence for useful goods to be produced. But take note, he was also cautioning that self-interest alone is dangerous. Pause this one. Hello. Hello. Baiso, record ko lecture? Ano naman? Di ka marungan. Murag sunod na kay murag layo pa ko.
Ito na lang ay padan.
Ay, shit. Ayun na, Jud. Ayun na, Jud. Ayun na, no need.
Hindi na nagiputok naman. Check mo.
Sige.
Kamu ra kay kanang tawag dito. Oo. Ito, mapapastig mo.
Ikaw bahala.
Oy, bala ka sa. Hindi, ay, kanang kanang gigigil.
Yeah. Hmm. Done. Ah? Okay.
Kapait, isa ka laki.
Anja?
Pati ka kapait.
Yeah. Ay, puy.
Ito, ako.
Yan na kay kuan. Pagubangkon. Yan kay pagubangkon.
Di pa klaro, hindi ko.
Yan na kay pagubangkon.
Wala na po. Pagpon.
Hmm. Ha? Saan sa? Aw. Aw na.
Ay,
Hmm.
akala sige.
Sorry tao niya. Tiga-record sa collector. Ah.
Okay, fine. Hindi mo jersey ron to.
Very good. Nakita ko dyan.
Ya daw. Eh, kita ka sa story.
Hmm. Daog dito. Congratulations.
Yes, kontra no.
Very good.
No, ikaw ano na eh.
Daog eh. Congratulations.
Pero kung sa jersey, guys,
Very good.
okay, that's it. That's it. Bye.
Bye. Right. Sorry. So, Adam Smith was cautioning that if every producer could charge whatever price he wanted, self-interest can become exploitation. And that is where competition enters. Competition. A producer charging too much risks losing customers. An employer paying too little risks losing workers. The self-interest provides the motive force, while competition disciplines that motive. Now, imagine a market containing 100 manufacturers of gloves. Every producer wants the highest possible profit. One producer might therefore want to charge an extremely high price, right? But competitors can offer gloves more cheaply, and customers can therefore leave. First, they buy the cheapest available gloves. And this provides the constraint, right? The producer therefore cannot simply impose whatever price he wants. But suppose the industry nevertheless earns unusually high profits. Those profits become a signal. Other entrepreneurs see the opportunity and enter the industry. Supply increases and the competition therefore intensifies, prices and profits fall. Okay, this is the one of the central insights of Smith, which is that high profits attract competition, and competition tends to eliminate unusually high profits, which is a net good to society, right? Because you'll have cheaper and more abundant goods and services which ordinary people can consume. But he also cautions that the process can work less effectively when producers work together. They cooperate to restrict competition. That's why Adam Smith was hostile to monopoly. Now, the market does not does more The market does more than determine prices. It does that, but it does more. It also determines what society produces. So suppose consumers suddenly want more gloves and fewer shoes. What happens? Glove prices will suddenly rise because there's more demand, right? So sellers will increase the price because there's more demand. And because there's more demand, the profits for gloves will also rise. The increase in the sales, the increase in the price. At the same time, while all that is happening, the prices of shoes and the profits on shoes will also fall. What's happening here? Workers and investors will transition. They will begin moving toward the production of gloves instead of shoes because the returns for gloves is higher. The production of gloves will expand while shoe production will contract. Eventually, the supply of gloves, however, catches up with the demand, and slowly prices begin falling again. Will return to normal. Notice what's happening here. There's no director who had to tell the suppliers to would order them to produce more of the certain product, the gloves. No central authority is needed to say we need 20% more gloves. Instead, the market communicated changing social demand through prices and profits. It was spontaneous. It was automatic.